for some people here. It really is my great pleasure and honour tonight to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Avril Alba. Dr. Avril Alba is Senior Lecturer in Holocaust Studies and Jewish Civilization in the Department of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney. Her fields of scholarship and expertise are the Holocaust and modern Jewish history. For nearly a decade, Avril was the Education Director at the Sydney Jewish Museum and also Project Director and Curator for a number of permanent exhibitions there. Tonight's talk, The Holocaust Remembered and Misremembered in Australia, Revisiting the Demidenko Darville Controversy, constitutes part of a much larger body of research that Avril is currently undertaking and exploring. And that is basically the shape of Holocaust memory in Australia. On a personal level, I first met Avril through my involvement in March of the Living Australia. Avril participated on a student trip as one of the educators along with me. But I have to say that in actual fact, Avril was the educator's educator. She really filled a role that we never advertised, and that was the role of scholar in residence. She really added so much to the educational value of March of the Living. So I really know firsthand that we are all in for an amazing treat tonight. Welcome, Avril.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frances. Now I'm even more nervous after that introduction. In addition to watching so many names that I know come on, and some pretty auspicious names as well. So I hope I'll do justice to the topic, and I welcome your questions afterwards. I also want to acknowledge that I am up here in Sydney on Gadigal land, so I want to acknowledge that and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I want to thank the Historical Society and the JHC, and the Historical Society in particular, not just for tonight, but because they've been incredibly generous with your amazing collection and your amazing archive. And one of my, particularly you were generous actually to one of my research assistants, Max Kaiser, who's been doing some wonderful work for me in Melbourne. And I actually look forward to utilising the archive a lot more in the future. So as Frances said, what I'm about to present tonight is part of a bigger project, and it's a project that I am currently working on. So it is, I'm not going to have all the answers, I'm afraid, but I guess it was born for me, and it's probably worth saying to an audience like this, out of a sort of, I guess, a personal realisation. And it was a realisation that happened when I still lived in Adelaide. I grew up in Adelaide. And my father was a survivor who came from Rovno, which is a place that many of you probably know, that was at the time in eastern Poland, now Ukraine. And his family were murdered as part of the mass shootings. And when I was still a university student in Adelaide, the Australian War Crimes trials took place. And we woke up to the news one morning. We lived in a suburb called Woodville, and we woke up to the news one morning that Polly had been arrested in a suburb 2 suburbs away from us. And that incident really made me sort of, in a sense, it was a jarring moment. It was a moment of realization, and it was a moment where I realized that what had happened to my family was always something that was part of my consciousness, but it was something that was actually part of my reality as well. And that the memory and the reverberations of what had happened in Europe were so close, and they were so much part of what our lives were here in Australia as well. And in many ways, I feel like now, 20, what is it now? Oh gosh, 30 years hence. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to explore that on a sort of a much more comprehensive and scholarly level. So that's where this interest came from. The Demidenko debate, of course, is tied so closely to those trials, and I will talk a little bit about that towards the end of the talk. I'm going to share my screen with you in a little while. I have a very basic PowerPoint, but the reason I've chosen to use it and to break the rule of never reading from a PowerPoint is because I am actually going to read this presentation tonight. I promise you I will do it as animatedly as I can, but I don't usually, those of you who I've taught with before know that I don't usually like to read, but this subject matter is so detailed and there are so many players involved that I have decided to do so. So I apologize, but I hope that's okay, and I hope that the PowerPoint will help you keep, in a sense, keep up with the amount of players in this. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you see a failure of memory up in front of you, the Demidenko-Darville debate. Okay, so here we go. As I said to Francis, I'm going to attempt to do this within 35-40 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions. So, appeals to Holocaust memory are typically made with the express goal of harnessing its power to illuminate other instances of racial or anti-Semitic persecution and to highlight the injustice at hand. Now, against this backdrop, the curious Australian case of Helen Demidenko Darville, the author of the novel The Hand That Signed the Paper, provides a startling exception. Beyond the bizarre nature of the literary hoax that was enacted by Helen Demidenko, the supposed descendant of Ukrainian peasants, who was subsequently unmasked as Helen Darville, the daughter of middle-class English migrants, perhaps the most perplexing aspect of this episode was that its use of anti-Semitic and racist tropes to provide the scaffolding for a book that claimed to explore and explain the history and memory of the Holocaust. I'm just going to ask anyone who's not muted to just mute yourself because there's a bit of background noise coming through. So thanks for that. Now, had the work been judged as political scientist Peter Christoph declared it to be, and I quote, a shallow, immature, and ultimately anti-Semitic novel, end quote, summarily dismissed and never heard of again, it would barely have rated a mention in its time, and even less so would it be worthy of retrospective analysis. Yet the fact that Demidenko Darville's The Hand That Signed the Paper was awarded 3 of Australia's top literary awards means that the Australian literary establishment received it very seriously indeed. And as such, it remains of interest with regard to its significance in and for Australian cultural and political history. Now, in this talk, I revisit the Demidenko-Darville debate with the express aim of delineating and unpacking its importance as a refraction of Australia's racial and identity politics of the time, revealing the somewhat shaky foundations upon which the nascent Australian multiculturalism of the 1990s rested. And here she is. The Hand That Signed the Paper is a short novel that narrates the wartime history of Ukrainian peasants, the Kovalenko brothers, who, with the German invasion of the former USSR in 1941, volunteered to serve in the SS Ukrainian Auxiliary Police. The Kovalenkos aid the Nazis in the murder of East European Jewry, both in shooting campaigns and in the death camps of occupied Poland. What makes this novel Australian is that its narrator, first-generation Australian Fiona Kovalenko, tells her uncle and father's stories from the vantage point of Queensland in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The narrative recounts in often gratuitously horrific detail the wartime deeds of these men, interspersed with Fiona's reflections on their migration to Australia, her own childhood as the daughter of migrants, and her path to understanding her family's history. The text connects the Kovalenko brothers' brutal past to the Australian present from the outset, beginning at the moment that Fiona Kovalenko is driving to visit her uncle Vitaly upon hearing that he had recently been charged with war crimes. Now, the initial success of the novel was arguably driven by Demidenko Darville's authenticity as a supposed first-generation Australian of mixed Ukrainian-Irish background, and her connected claims that some of the materials for her novel were based on oral history acquired from her relatives. In then Helen Demidenko's own words, quote, and you've got it in front of you, "It would be ridiculous to pretend that this book is unhistorical. I have used historical events and people where necessary throughout the book." Now, when interviewed by Rosemary Sorensen on 3RN on the 4th of September 1994, Demidenko referenced her family's influence in a refrain that she would consistently reiterate until her true identity was exposed a year later, stating unequivocally that, quote, "This is from my own experience," end quote. Indeed, Demidenko not only capitalised on her supposed ethnic origins, but she revelled in them, turning up to prestigious literary events in her costume that you see there, her colourful, if at times talking about her colourful, if at times embarrassing, ethnic upbringing. Now, commentators both disposed towards and disgusted by the book noted that Demidenko's claim to authenticity was undeniably a factor that strengthened its reception both in literary and popular circles. Now, when she was outed by the Courier Mail's David Bentley on the 19th of August 1995 as the daughter of British migrants Harry and Grace Darville, the book and its author's infamy were assured, as the greatest literary hoax in Australian history since the Malley affair began to unfold. Beyond the identity fraud perpetrated by Demidenko Darville, what made and makes the novel controversial is that from these materials, supposedly based on oral testimonies acquired from her Ukrainian relatives, Demidenko Darville connected the experience of Stalin's engineered famine of Ukraine in the 1930s, known as the Holodomor, with the Holocaust in an explicitly causal paradigm. As Fiona Kovalenko states in the opening pages of the novel, what is clear in the mind of this protagonist is, quote, how the Ukrainian famine bled into the Holocaust and one fed the other, end quote. Thus begins a tale in which the genocide of European Jewry is characterised as an unfortunate but inevitable episode in a vicious cycle of revenge, one in which Jewish communists inflicted a brutal famine upon Ukrainians who then retaliated through active participation in the final solution. The Judeo-Bolshevik myth was thus resurrected in sunny suburban Queensland. Now living out their twilight years in the multicultural landscape of 1990s Australia, Fiona's uncle Vitaly and her father Evgeny find themselves yet again victims of the Jews, those determined to set the cycle of vicious revenge in play again, through their insistence that even in distant Australia, war crimes must be undertaken. Of course, similarly to their role in the former USSR, the said Jews are too clever to undertake such ventures themselves, but rather do so through their influence and control of key politicians, most notably the, quote, silver budgie Zionist bloody hawky Bob Hawke, end quote. In 1990s Australia, these now Zionist Jews are portrayed in the novel as bringing hatred and revenge upon themselves yet again, this time through manipulating the Australian political and legal establishment into initiating war crimes trials. In a stunning reversal of victims and perpetrators, the novel thus sets the events and memory of the Holocaust firmly into an Australian setting, with the war crimes undertaken in South Australia in the early 1990s providing a new canvas upon which these accusations and prejudices were redrawn. Now, despite numerous misgivings from judges and outright refusals to edit the book, the Hand was awarded the prestigious Vogel on the 22nd of September 1993. Post-publication, the Hand continued its triumphant march through Australia's literary circles, first being awarded the most prestigious prize in Australian fiction, the Miles Franklin, in June 1995, and the Australian Literature Society, the ALS, Gold Medal in July of the same year. Demidenko had taken the hat trick of Australian literary honours, yet the controversy surrounding her book was only just beginning. When Helen Demidenko was exposed in August 1995 as Helen Darville, debate over the novel and its author again raged in the op-ed and letters to the editor pages of Australia's major newspapers. The most acrimonious of these debates were those concerned with the book's ostensibly historical aspects. Was Demidenko Darville simply rehashing some of the vilest anti-Semitic myths employed by the Nazis to justify their genocide, or probing deep into the minds of those who committed the murders to try and understand the most inhuman of human actions? This question animated debates in literary, political, and historical circles, and most poignantly, perhaps, created fierce tension within and between two groups at the heart of the debate, Australia's Jewish and Ukrainian communities. As the news of the Franklin Award broke, however, it was Holocaust survivor and historian Jacques Adler, familiar to many in this audience, I'm sure, who provided one of the first historical correctives and a clear statement on why, in his view, the novel was both historically and morally bankrupt. Contemporary Australian fiction has taken many directions, but no one has so far tried to find historical justification for genocide. The crime that this novel commits is not that it is bad fiction masquerading as honesty. The travesty of history at this work's core is that it is an apologia for genocide. One can only hope that the history serves its victims more honourably in next year's round of prizes. Adler continued to say, Ukrainians volunteered for genocide duty. They chose their path, their friends, their enemies. Adler's piece was subsequently perceived by some members of the Ukrainian community to be engendering hate. For example, George Javosky, the then Director of Public Affairs for the Association of Ukrainians in Victoria, wrote in The Age, "We are all victims of history. All our hands are stained with blood. Let us resolve to put these hatreds behind us and not seek to imply that the horrors of the time are the responsibility of one side only. All that we'll succeed in doing is establishing the conditions for a repetition of the past. There is no place for this in Australia." Javosky thus not only reinforced the ideas of equal responsibility that Adler sought to refute by recourse to the historical record, but also reproduced this version of history with the express aim of warning that such history could repeat itself, even on Australian shores. Now, while clearly legitimately concerned with all Ukrainians being tarred by the same brush as those Demidenko Darville resurrected in her novel, what was troubling about Javosky's response was his accusation that it was Adler's exposure of the historical and moral inversion of Holocaust history and memory as articulated in The Hand that would threaten Australia's multicultural status quo. In this logic, telling the truth about the past could only serve to fuel hatred in the present. This fundamental disagreement as to the accuracy and utility of the Holocaust history contained in Demidenko Darville's novel provided a microcosm of the historical and moral confusion yet to come. Now, the echo of these early debates continued to animate deliberations concerning the literary and historical worth of the novel, as well as its resonance in and for contemporary Australian life. Vogel and Miles Franklin judge Jill Kitson remained throughout the various debates and scandals that accompanied the novel one of The Hand's greatest advocates. Her reasoning is evidenced in the many interviews she gave post the Franklin Award. Speaking to the Sydney Morning Herald's Angela Benny, she enthusiastically explained that Demidenko's book fitted the award criterion admirably, referring to a key phrase in Miles Franklin's will, which required that the award go to a work portraying, quote, any phase of Australian life. For Kitson, one of Demidenko's greatest achievements had been her ability to synthesize her family's European history with her own Australian identity. Quote, Helen had to exercise an extraordinary literary imagination in order to create some aspects of this book. She creates a protagonist who needs to understand this difference between who she is as an Australian and what makes her very different from her migrant parents. She becomes her family's recording angel, end quote. Further, for Kitson, not only did Demidenko illuminate the past, she also showed us what we might do with that past in the present in order to integrate it into our own experience. Describing what she saw as an obvious strength of the novel, Kitson opined that this book is about the migrant experience, which we as Australians all share. This country has taken in migrants, whether they were as convicts or refugees. We Australians, so many of us, all seem to carry some dead heart of shame or guilt about the past generation or generation's actions. Helen shows us how to integrate this, end quote. Now, Kitson's comments not only revealed a rather rose-coloured view of Australia's past migration policies, but also demonstrated a belief that somehow the version of history outlined in The Hand provided a model par excellence for coming to terms with the past. As prefigured in the exchange between Adler and Jaworski, others were not so easily convinced. And in June and July of 1995, the battle raged as to whether the history of the Holocaust, as told in The Hand, would prove divisive or salutary in contemporary Australian life. One of the first journalists to interrogate both the history contained in The Hand and question its contribution to cultural harmony was the Age's Pamela Bone. In a scathing attack on the novel, she described what she saw as the moral failings of its historical framing. The central thesis of the book, as Demidenko explained in an interview on ABC Radio, is that the Jewish Holocaust was, quote, probably a fairly inevitable facet of European history. Yes, Uncle Vitaly is guilty, but guilty only because of the wrongs done to him and his people. This is the other side of the Holocaust, except, as John Pilger has said, there is no other side to the Holocaust. Focusing on the issues of individual choice, Bone refuted the inevitability that Demidenko and her novel advocated. In particular, its position that there was no possibility for moral choice in the Holocaust. Quote, I am speaking from a position of safety. Even so, I refuse to excuse mass murder by saying that we are all capable of it, because most people are not capable of it. Some Ukrainians, some Germans, some Poles committed acts of terrible cruelty during terrible times. Some chose to die rather than take part in it. Many were able to pretend that they didn't know it was happening. Judith Armstrong directly responded to Bone's article, taking issue with her assessment of Demidenko's work as a justification of murder. Rather, Armstrong opined, in Demidenko's view, the, quote, identical horseshit of Soviet and German propaganda had turned the Ukrainian peasants into savages, conditioned to kill without argument. Pamela Bone portrays this to be a justification for murder. Another reader might see that the atrocities at Treblinka, Babi Yar are totally condemned in this novel, as are the demands the Nazis put on their minions. Tolstoy would have understood that. Famously pacifist though he was, he blamed the leaders, not the foot soldiers, for the carnage of war. Bone and Armstrong's exchange provides a microcosm of the moral confusion wrought by historical ignorance. Armstrong clearly did not either know or fully grasp the circumstances of Ukrainian involvement in the genocide, its voluntary nature, and the historical antecedents of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. As such, while she sought to enlighten her Australian readers, whom she believed could not possibly understand the circumstances under which such acts were carried out, in actuality, she muddies the historical and moral waters, turning voluntary killers into martyrs, death camp guards into Tolstoy's foot soldiers rather than war criminals. Indeed, for Armstrong, Demidenko enlarges our understanding of the limited options available to Uncle Vitaly as she, quote, challenges her cushioned Australian readers to imagine the terrifying boundary between heroism and survival, martyrdom and brutalisation. Now, Armstrong was not the only commentator for whom historical ignorance and moral confusion becomes entwined. Some took this confusion even further, inserting it into debates raging in Australia at the time about the upcoming Australian war crimes trials. Literary critic Andrew Reamer pointed out that Demidenko Darville, quote, insisted that she wished to tell the story of the persecution of Jews by her Ukrainian compatriots, not from the perspective of, quote, us and them, but as a chapter in the continuing history of hatred, prejudice, brutality, and revenge, which the forthcoming war crimes trials in Adelaide would only perpetuate, end quote. That Demidenko Darville's history was instructive in the present was a key point for Reamer and other commentators on all sides of the debate, who saw the novel as containing legitimate commentary on key social and political issues of the time. It is to this connection between the Demidenko Darville affair, the Australian war crimes trials, and their import for understanding the intersection between the memory of the Holocaust and racial and cultural diversity in the Australian sphere that I will now turn. The Australian war crimes trials took place in Adelaide, South Australia from 1990 to 1993. While there were a variety of legal and political attempts to limit and bring attention to the amount of suspected war criminals who had entered Australia in the post-war period, these remained unsuccessful until journalist Mark Aaron's investigation of Australia's post-war migration policies. The results of these investigations would be first televised on leading ABC radio and television current affairs programs in 1986 and eventually chronicled in his books Sanctuary, Nazi Refugees in Australia and War Criminals Welcome Australia, a Sanctuary for Fugitive War Criminals since 1945. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 war criminals were allowed to migrate to Australia in the immediate post-war period, with most hailing from Eastern Europe. Providing false information on documents, in interviews and screening processes, they most often claimed to have been forced labourers under National Socialism. Many were found to have been collaborators in the extermination process. Now, scholars have pointed to the fact that in all likelihood, Australian migration officials knew of such activities, but turned a blind eye as they sought to recruit Soviet double agents from within these migrant groups. While there was a small spate of protests from within the Jewish community in the early 1950s, as survivors of Nazi terror found themselves sometimes cheek by jowl with their former persecutors on ships and in migrant hostels, they were not long-lived, as support at that time for what was viewed as a Jewish cause was not forthcoming. Hence, the War Crimes Amendment Act only came into force in 1988 as a result of lobbying both by Jewish and other individuals, although the Special Investigations Unit, the SIU, the federal body charged with investigating suspected war criminals, was already in operation from 1987. While the SIU investigated hundreds of cases over a 5-year period, only 3 perpetrators, 2 of Ukrainian background, Polyukovich and Bereshovsky, and 1 an ethnic German serving in the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police Force, Wagner, were brought to trial. No convictions were obtained due to insufficient eyewitness testimony. The trials were abandoned in 1992 under the Keating government, and to this day, Australia has not recommitted itself to reopening war crimes trials with regard to either Nazi war criminals or those from subsequent genocides residing in Australia. Helen Demidenko was awarded the Vogel in September of '93, some 4 months after Ivan Polyukovich was acquitted by the Adelaide Court of War Crimes. As outlined, the hand begins with Fiona Kovalenko's distress at hearing the news of war crimes charges being laid against her uncle Vitaly, and is peppered throughout with references to the Australian war crimes trials. At one point, Fiona, our narrator's best friend, tells her, quote, "I want you to understand that I think it's wrong to try them, that trying people for what they did in a war legitimizes other wartime activities that are left untried. War is a crime in itself," end quote. The novel's consistent position on the trials is that they are unnecessary at best and destructive at worst. Vindicating this overall perspective, the work ends with Uncle Vitaly escaping his day in court through death, absolved by the priest who administers his last rites and surrounded by his loving family. After his death, Fiona writes letters to various Australian newspapers and magazines protesting against the trials, and finds some kind of solace in conversation with the descendant of a Quaker victim of the Nazis at the site of the former death camp of Treblinka. So too, those who would honour the hand with the Miles Franklin would also connect the story, the import of the story, I should say, to the trials and the moral challenge they placed on Australian society. The Miles Franklin citation read, quote, "Novels about the migrant experience seem to be seizing upon us, seizing the high ground in contemporary Australian fiction, in contrast to fiction about the more vapid aspects of Australian life. In particular, they are incorporating into the cultural memory first-hand experience of the major historical events of the century, events from which Australia has been largely insulated, but which are a growing component of contemporary Australian life, even to the extent of requiring of us intricate moral judgments, as the most recent debate over the war crimes legislation has highlighted," end quote. Indeed, the trials arguably underpin the novel's Australian framework. In the moral universe of the text, they are the contemporary setting in which the Holocaust as a cycle of revenge continues to be played out on Australian shores. In short, The Hand portrays these exceedingly complex legal undertakings as the work of a vengeful lobby group, intent on causing distress to those who wish to simply retain the peaceful status quo of multicultural Australia. Now, this point was not lost on Alan Dershowitz, who attacked the moral slippage with regard to the novel's characterisation of the tribes. Demidenko's greatest anger is directed against the Jewish survivors, who sought to bring their Ukrainian tormentors to justice after the war by having them tried as war criminals. The silver budgie Zionists, he got that one wrong, are destroying the families of the Ukrainian killers who emigrated to Australia after the war. It is the Jews who are making them hate. This is a quote from the novel. My sister is starting to hate. My sister who never hated anything. In point of fact, while Jewish communal leaders were active in lobbying the then Hawke Labor government to undertake the trials, they did not find unequivocal support in the Jewish or survivor community. Conrad Queet, Chief Historian of the Special Investigations Unit and expert witness for the prosecution in the Polyakovich case, points to the fact that many survivors were actually not publicly supportive of the trials, as they feared they would trigger an increase of anti-Semitic sentiment in Australia. Further, Queet notes, as we say, fierce criticism was articulated by the ethnic communities to which the suspected war criminals belonged. Their spokespersons chose to speak of injustice or an act of revenge, of defamation of innocent people. Their disapproval found its most vehement expression in the form of a warning that the war crimes debate would stir up animosities and ethnic tensions, in particular between Jewish and Eastern European communities. It was claimed that this, in turn, could threaten the fabric of Australia's exemplary multicultural society. So in other words, if Jewish migrants spoke about, indeed testified as to their experiences at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators, both during and after the Holocaust, it was they who would threaten the multicultural status quo. In its framing of the Australian war crimes trials as show trials, the novel's historical and moral distortions found their logical end, an end in which justice was neither possible nor desirable, where keeping Australia a tolerant and harmonious multicultural society could only be achieved through forgetting rather than working through the past. Now, puzzled as to how such a reversal of victim to victimiser could have eventuated in the multicultural and supposedly tolerant Australia of the 1990s, Robert Mann, a commentator familiar to, I'm sure, all of you, was led to ponder, quote, "Are we not part of that common civilization that absorbed the shock of Auschwitz and which internalized its meaning?" End quote. Mann admits that it is at this very point that the moral confusion prompted by the novel's version of the Holocaust threatens to overwhelm understanding. And he writes further, "There is one aspect of the Demidenko affair I still find extremely puzzling. The Hand that signed the paper, a work honoured by 3 sets of Australian literary judges, seems to be not only an unmistakably anti-Semitic novel, but an unmistakably anti-Semitic novel about the Holocaust. And yet it would be absurd to regard Australia as an anti-Semitic country or as a country where anti-Semitism is on the rise." He did write this many years ago, on the rise. Or to fail to notice that until the Demidenko affair, no segment of Australian society was more reliably hostile to expressions of racism or anti-Semitism than its literary community. Mann was and is assuredly correct. There is nothing in Australia's past or present that would justify characterising it as an anti-Semitic country. But what the Hand, the historical ignorance it revealed, and the moral confusion it generated showed was that, in Mann's prescient phrase, Australia's, quote, "culture of forgetting" proved itself yet again to be unable or unwilling to face up to the less relaxed and comfortable aspects of its past. seeing such episodes as impediments rather than opportunities to create a just foundation for a truly tolerant present. Now, it is doubtful, to my mind, that in resurrecting the Judeo-Bolshevik myth in sunny Queensland, Helen Demidenko aimed to do anything beyond characterise the history of the Holocaust in Europe and its memory in Australia as embodying a simplistic and ongoing story of ethnic revenge. But whatever her intentions, in actuality, her novel ignited and laid bare a complex and enduring debate as to what preserving ethnic and racial harmony in Australia truly entailed. Thank you. I hope I kept to time.
Thank you so much, Avril. There's so much to think about and take in there, so many layers to unpack and reflect upon. Okay, we've got time for some questions. How will we do this? Would someone, like, if anyone wants to ask a question, perhaps just unmute yourselves and we'll try and just do one at a time, okay? Because I can't see everybody on screen. And please try and keep it to questions if possible. Would someone like to begin?
I'll go, Francis.
Thank you, Gavin.
Avril, thank you for a fascinating address. Do you regard the novel as anti-Semitic, one, and two, does one's view of the hand depend on one's philosophical, political view on freedom of speech?
Oh, that's interesting. When I say, let me try and approach this.
Yes.
Do I consider the novel anti-Semitic? Even after everything I've read about this, I'm still at a loss to really understand her intent. But what seems certain to me is that the novel itself contains anti-Semitic, tropes and
Yes.
stereotypes, etc., etc. So in that way, yes, I would say it is an anti-Semitic novel. Whether she herself is an anti-Semite, I'm not sure. She was what we tend to forget is she was incredibly young when she wrote this, right?
Yes.
And had sort of claimed to have all these, this career experience and writing experience. And she was, I don't know, she was something like 21 or 20.
Yes, she was. Yes.
At the time. So I can't speak about her intent in terms of it being an anti-Semitic novel, but I could say that I feel strongly that there are elements in it that are certainly anti-Semitic, not the least of which being this sort of this resurrection of a Judeo-Bolshevik type myth in it. So yes.
Yes.
Second part of your question was...
Does one's view of the hand depend on one's philosophical and political views on freedom of speech?
Oh, yeah. No, because I think, it's interesting. Whenever I've spoken about this, a lot of people bring up that issue and also the related issue of, did it matter that she wasn't who she said she was, right? Because they're kind of connected issues. And I think the thing is that it's fine to not be, writers use pseudonyms, but she kind of broke a contract, like with the audience, because she not only used a pseudonym, she said she was someone else, and that played into what the novel was. So I feel like in that way she did in some way break a sort of pact, but I'm not sure that it's a freedom of speech issue in general. Like, I think you can still, as I say, you can defend her right to write the novel, but then I think it behooves us to point out what is bad about the novel. Yeah.
That's fair enough. I mean, I've heard Robert Mann's friend Raymond Gator describe it as an anti-Semitic novel. I'm not sure I agree with that. I agree with you that she was very young. She's recently obtained a law degree from Oxford, and she's substantially older now. Is it a well-written novel? It probably is, but it impacts obviously on people's sensitivities and views. I mean, I don't know that it can be described. Well, as you say, you don't know what her intention was, and we can't assume her intention in writing it. But it certainly provoked a lot of intellectual debate and interesting discussion, and still does this long after the event.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question? Hello, can you hear me? Bill Rubenstein.
Hi, Bill. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? Two questions. Have you had any contact with Darville?
No, I haven't.
Okay. And secondly, it is a fact that the Jewish community here did not pursue, certainly not with any great measure of strength, the prosecution of alleged war criminals here. Never, ever, at the time of Eichmann, into the Israeli wars or anything like that. It arose out of the blue in the late 1980s, basically, or mid-1980s. And in fact, hasn't been pursued since then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where, Conrad's comment is so preachy. Like he's spot on, right? There seems to be, an element of fear of precisely this kind of, stirring up of animosity behind it. Absolutely.
And can I just chip in before I mute myself again? I've no doubt you've read The Nazis Next Door by Eric Lichtblau, disclosing the huge number of Nazis entering the United States post-war with the connivance of the CIA and the FBI that dwarfed any number of Nazis coming into this country.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gavin. Can I just, Karen has put up here, in 2020, do you see the culture of forgetting that you explained as having moved aside to allow a more comprehensive culture of remembering?
Ah, wow. Okay, what an amazing question. Yeah, I'm looking at some of the ones in the chat. I hope so. I guess that's my answer. I hope so. No, look, I think we can see progression. I think in particular when we look at our view of Indigenous history now, I think we are more open as a country to starting to listen to what is often referred to as truth telling, and to really pursue what is necessary for a thoroughgoing kind of reconciliation. So I think that is one way of looking at it, and hopefully so. But as we know, there's always, I think what's quite telling is whenever there's a new history curriculum, right, there's always a backlash, right? There's always some kind of backlash against it. And I think that that's when we see the discomfort with the past, right? It's always something about the way that Australian history is being told, or other aspects of history. And I think it's interesting. I think someone should write a PhD on that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Nina has a question.
Well, I first of all wanted to thank you for contextualizing it within the culture of forgetting, and you've partly answered that. But there were just two quick things. One is that nobody, as far as I remember at the time, spoke at all about the fact that there is no limitation period on crimes against humanity, and that this was not a Jewish issue. This was an issue of pursuing crimes against humanity in the way that they should be pursued. This was something that I felt was and continues to be omitted. And the other thing is, I think it's a little bit harsh to say that the Jewish community in Australia has done nothing about crimes against humanity. I have cutting after cutting on the Calais case. I had meetings with the Latvian Prime Minister. We were published in, our quotes were published in international papers. We pursued that matter very strongly and very avidly. We were late to the game, but at that stage, when the Calais issue came up, I think the Jewish community was very much to the fore. And that is when I was interviewed, frame it within the context of crimes against humanity. And I was repeatedly being asked, why are you seeking revenge? To which my answer was, this is not about revenge, this is about justice.
Yeah, thank you. Point taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And for those just a second, can I just say thank you, Nina? And for those who don't know Nina Bassett, a number of times she's been president of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria and sits on the ECAJ. And I personally have been the beneficiary of her wisdom and experience. So thank you, Nina. Can I just, there was, who else there was another woman who wanted to speak?
Yes, please. I'd like to ask a question. I followed this very closely, and I consider the book to be deeply racist and plagiarised. And I remember that Jill Kitson and David Marr supported her as an authentic as an authentic voice. And I wonder that they have never backed down when she was exposed as both a plagiarist on this occasion and on other occasions when she plagiarised the writings of one of her teachers. And I remained very angry. I had a kind of identity crisis over this, and it affected my relationships with other people who told me it's just a book and it's ancient history and so on. But I hold a grudge against Jill Kitson and David Marr, who supported her as an authentic, capable writer and didn't back down when she was exposed as both a plagiarist and a racist. So just what are your views on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right, and they didn't. It's very perplexing, you know, as you could tell from my presentation. But I think what's really interesting about what you just said is that is precisely what I think is really fascinating about this book, is that on both a societal level and as you experienced on a personal level, that it caused divides and it caused enormous acrimony and debate. And, you know, those of us who remember that there were television debates, there were, you know, debates all the way through the newspapers. And it really sort of uncovered something really uncomfortable. So I guess all I can say is I resonate with, you know, with what you're saying, and it is still something. I think that's why Robert Mann's book really spoke to me as well, is that it to this day, it is almost confounding. You know, it's like, how did this actually happen? You know, like, how did we get to the point where this is taken so seriously? But what I found fascinating, as I said, and I guess that's what prompted my desire to look at this further, is that it's the work this novel did, right, in society, and how it sort of uncovered things, right, really, really difficult things, that was really fascinating. Frances, do you want me to address some of the questions in the chat?
I was just going to read them out so everyone knows what you're addressing, if that's, and then we'll go.
Yeah, sure.
Probably time for a little bit more. From Philip Mendez, please. Obviously commending you on a nice presentation, but he's wondering whether after all this time you found any evidence as to where Darville got her ideas and prejudices from, given that she was not, you know, remotely even, you know, nowhere near coming from an East European background.
No, I honestly, I haven't found anything. If someone has, let me know. but I haven't. It's a good question, Bill. It really is. I don't know. There are many things about her that are very confounding, I must admit. And I think you need more a psychologist than a historian to understand parts of her story, I'm afraid. Sorry, not a good answer.
Okay, a question from Lily. Was this book removed from circulation?
It's quite hard to get a copy, I will say that. You can still, because I had one years ago and I must have tossed it away, and when I came back to do this, I found one, but I had to work quite hard to get an original copy. So I imagine yes. And I do believe that, in fact, some of them were pulped after the fact, after, you know, things were exposed, etc. But the other thing I haven't been able to find out definitively, I don't know if I'm just looking in the wrong places, but as I understand it, none of the awards were taken away. Now, I don't know if if anyone knows that if I'm incorrect in that, please let me know, but I have not been able to find evidence that the awards were taken away. So I don't know if you can't take them away. I don't know if that's part of these kinds of awards. But yeah, and there was an interesting question, the first one from David, about how did it get past the proofreading and the editors. That is a really interesting story, because some of the editors refused to edit it. It was really, so they basically kept going until they found someone that would, right? So people were disturbed by it. You know, people were disturbed by it, which is interesting in and of itself. But they did find someone who agreed finally to edit it. Anything else there? Can you see something I'm missing?
There's quite a bit there. I'm just mindful of time, and I maybe
Yep.
we'll take one more, and then we'll have to leave it another time. I'm just looking at Ron Honig's question.
Oh, Ron. Hi, Ron.
Hi.
So many familiar names. Is that the one that starts with "is the problem"?
Yes.
There is a very...
There's two, but the first one is the problem about the flimsiness of multiculturalism, that it couldn't cope with reality of ethnic conflict, and so it had to depend on silence, and then was this blown apart by the discovery of the stolen generation?
That is a really interesting question. I do think this, in part of my talk, I refer to sort of the fragile multiculturalism, and that is exactly what it feels like. That those early attempts, those moves towards multiculturalism, they were fine as long as we all felt good about eating each other's food, But once we started talking about more difficult issues, then it really it did become a much more fraught venture. I think the stolen generations, I think that was shocking on so many levels. I think it, in some ways it even goes beyond. And I think in that way, it was shown to be more shocking in a sense, because you think of the history wars that surrounded how we talk about Aboriginal history, and I think for Australians to begin to think about the fact that a genocide could have happened in their country was an enormous, it's one thing to argue about a genocide that happened somewhere else, but to come to a understanding what happens here, I think was a very, very big shift. So I think the stolen generation.
Think about the implications for Robert Mann in particular of that fight. You can see, the power of that, and it was no longer ethnic squabbling about things that happened in the past. It was us, and we were us Anglos who were part of that genocidal movement. We find, that's really hard to cope with, but it was much easier to cope with if we were ethnics.
Right, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's I'm going to have to think about that, Ron. I have to think quite a lot. Thank you. But
I'd say, Avril, you've given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. And on that note, I'd like to invite Pauline Rockman, co-chairperson of the Jewish Holocaust Centre, to thank you on behalf of all of us.
Answers. Wow, thank you, Avril, for an illuminating, such an interesting presentation. Though the events that took place over 20 years ago resonate very much today, and as Francis has said, gives us much to reflect upon. That was an episode that took place in that brief time between the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the war of terror, I suppose. And I keep thinking about the relevance today, especially with increased Holocaust denial, distortion, the rise of homophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. And it's work that you do and other educators, the work of our Holocaust centres now in most capital cities. And it's also so chilling to see that Holocaust distortion is alive and well. And of course, then we look at the internet and the huge impact and presence of the social network. And I suppose perhaps we can be heartened a bit by Facebook having banned Holocaust denial and distortion last week, followed not long by Twitter following suit. And let's hope that they'll now face that challenge and apply this policy. So I just want to thank you again to bringing something that's quite a big part of our Australian history, making it more relevant and making it, again, something to reflect on for what affects us today. Thank you again. Thank you, Avril.
Pleasure, and thank you all for coming along. And as I said, it's lovely to see so many familiar names and also to see so many unfamiliar names. So it's really, really my pleasure. Thank you, and thank you again to both the museum, the Jewish Holocaust Centre, and the Historical Society, both of whom have been very helpful to me at key junctures. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Francis.
Thank you so much. David, a word from the sponsors?
Gavin.
I think I've unmuted myself. I'll do this as quickly as I can. Our next event is with Dr. Henry Liu on Patterson of Israel, and that will be on Thursday, the 26th of November at 7:30 on the same Zoom link as tonight, and no doubt David will put something around closer to the event. Second matter is we are bleeding financially because normally we have in-person events at which people contribute $25. And if anyone, I think David has listed the banking details of the Australian Jewish Historical Society. Anyone feels inclined to contribute the $25, it would be very much appreciated. And just last, can I just draw your attention to the Australian Jewish Historical Society, the New South Wales branch, is spending over $30,000 over the next 3 years on digitising and updating the AJHS website. And that will now include a database of Jewish refugees arriving in Australia via Melbourne between 1946 and 1954 that was digitised in 2004 by Lionel Sharp and others. From the Australian Jewish Genealogical Society. It will massively, the National Library of Australia will digitise 180 years of Australian Jewish newspapers with more than 200,000 pages, which will be openly accessible through Trove, which those interested will know as Australia's free online research portal. And there will be researchers over the next 3 years will be able to type in the name of a person. Important details will appear, such as births, deaths, marriages, military history, arrival in Australia, occupations, address, and so on. Helen Gardner has just completed indexing Jewish births for Tasmania, and Liz James has done the same for Melbourne and Port Phillip, and the Sadie Pritchard South Australian births, and there will be a massive amount on the database in relation to that. And all details for Jews in Australia will be updated, including Melbourne Hebra Kadisha records have been downloaded for access. And the Australian, importantly, the Australian Historical Society journals will be downloaded on the Trove website, but not for the last 4 or 5 years, because we maintain our membership through the interest of people receiving the journal in return for their subscription. So the historical record will be from the beginning on the Trove website. Now, I think that's probably all that needs to be said. Thank you everyone for organising this, particularly David, who's a fabulous secretary and keeps this show on the road and is technically able to organise this Zoom. We've had, I think at one point, over 50 participants, and a number of those were doubles. So we've probably had over 100 people attending tonight. Thank you, Avril. It was a fabulous address. It raises more questions than it answers, I suspect, but it will forever be an intellectually stimulating debate. Interesting you come from Adelaide, where Ern Malley also comes from. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
No, thank you.